It's not for posterity. This is just for us. So, Hoover takes office in March of 29. And right away, I was talking about this yesterday, I think, the farmers have some serious problems. And as some of you really figured out with your DBQ, the major farmer problem is they're overproducing, right? That they're still making too much stuff. And really, one of the major problems is they want something that will keep their you guys remember, some of you read on the DBQ about if the price of the railroad changed shipping rates just a little bit, that would put the farmer out of business, right? So what they wanted was what we would call today a guaranteed price. They wanted to grow their seeds into crops, be they wheat or corn or sorghum or barley or any of the tons of options you could grow. And if for some reason the price wasn't that, the government would make up the difference, right? Well, we know that Coolidge had vetoed the bill called the McNary-Hogan bill. That didn't get going. Well, under Hoover, Congress tries again, and they do pass an important law. It's called the Agricultural Marketing Act. It's still, the Federal Farm Board still exists. And it's designed to keep sort of like an emergency fund to loan money to farmers groups, farmer cooperatives. So farmers, if you would organize, will have $500 million to help keep your price. The problem is it never really works. It doesn't work because they produce so much, the money runs out immediately almost. It's just not enough money to cover the losses that these farmers are going to experience. This is a problem where it's very hard to go to a farmer and say, you have to work less. You have to work less hard. You have to produce less, and then you'll make more money. I mean, that sounds paradoxical, right? Like, sit around and don't make much and you'll make more money. And farmers aren't going to buy onto that. So they keep growing, and these surpluses, this isn't enough to stop it. And tens of thousands of farmers are going to become unemployed, homeless, basically, as a result of this period. So this doesn't really work, but the idea of trying to have a fund to stabilize the price, right? And keep in mind, Republicans are absolutely not going to support things like price ceilings, right? Like caps or price floors, things that sound very socialistic. Yeah. So this doesn't really work well, but it's baby steps, y'all. But the big event that I want to get into today and really talk the most about is the Great Depression. And the Depression has so many causes. I gave a list of about, I think, 9, but in reality, there are over a dozen, and you could even argue there are even more than that. And I'm going to give you an acronym in just a minute from what I teach my world history class about the Depression. And that's definitely something you need to memorize, which is sort of like how the Depression occurred. But it's going to be a much longer list than that. So nonetheless, what happens is, as you can imagine, the economy is just booming along, and there are a lot of warning signs. Like during this period, banks are going bust, right? During this period, there are moments of warning signs, and you can see these sort of spikes that were occurring. And I'm going to explain why the stock market became sort of the bastion for so many people. But before I do that, just look and see here that when you invest in the stock market, I want to explain to you how the stock market works. I guess I should go back to here. So the way the stock market works is normally you buy a security with the hope that that company will be profitable. When the company is profitable, its value rises naturally, right? The company is successful, and when it does, it pays its shareholders dividends. So what you get is like some of the profits of the company come to you. Now, in the 20s, initially, very, very few people were on the stock market, right? Like, this is not like a common thing. Today, myself and most of your parents probably have what is called like a 401k, which is an individual retirement account, and probably it's in mutual funds, which means it's a diversified portfolio made up of multiple types of stocks, right? That's what the smart retiree of the 21st century does. Well, that is not what the 20th century early American did. They didn't portfolios of mutual funds. So only really a handful of people actually traded on Wall Street. But there were businesses that we call brokerages. So brokers handled people's money. So they would handle large amounts of money on Wall Street. And the 20s was very, very profitable for investors. Like people had money. And so this is going to create a big sort of boom in where to put the money. Everybody can't open a business. So how about investing in someone else's business, right? And so you're going to see a huge growth in people putting money into the stock market. And then one of the big takeaways you need to know is what's called margin buying. Buying stocks on margin is borrowing money to invest in the stock market. So you only had to put like 10% of the money down, like 10% of the cash up front. When you sold the security, when you sold the stock, right, you would pay back whoever loaned you the money and you would profit the difference, right? So the idea was that you were going to make money. So you would borrow money, invest the borrowed money, and then wait until you sold your shares. And people would try to do this very quickly. So you wanted like a quick return on your investment, ROI, right? Quick return. And so people are putting down as little as 10% and buying thousands of dollars of stocks, right? And the public starts really becoming fascinated by this. During this period had been invented the ticker, the stock ticker, which is like this glass bubble. I should have one on here. I'll look for one and put you on here. But people would be investing in companies, you know, like the Central Railway Company. And this cartoon says, it seems like only yesterday that I owned stock in this company, right? And now he's a homeless guy riding around the rails, right? So lots of people were buying it. And historically, and you should know this term from economics or from investment, finance, historically, there are stocks that are really high value, and they're called blue chip stocks, right? Blue chip securities are considered safe bets because they're companies that have been around a very long time. They have a lot of capital, a lot of money. And so people would invest in blue chips, historically. And so on this list, these are some of the most recent big blue chips. So you'll see like AT&T, Chevron, Dow, Exxon, IBM. So these, they don't give you a fast return. Now, they weren't in the 20s. That's 2020 right there. Sorry. That's some of the most recent blue chips. So when you invest in these companies, you're not going to get a quick return. You're not going to get a 20% or 25%, but you're going to get 5 to 8% annually, which is way more than you're going to get in the bank, right? So if you sit around for 30 years, your money will end up making you money. And so that's what historically, investors who aren't looking for quick returns did. Well, during this period, people moved away from blue chips and they started investing in other companies that were not proven. They were just sort of brand new. And you had like 30 different automobile companies during the 20s, right? And people are investing too many. It's way too many, If you think about it now, we have the big three. And so there were tons of radio companies. In the movie Cinderella Man, he invests in taxi cab company in New York, right? So all these investments, but they're not proven, okay? And then that leads to what's called speculative stock buying, okay? And speculative stock is not retirement plan stocks. You understand? These aren't people buying blue chips. These are people buying stocks, looking for a quick return and then selling them. It's kind of like flip this house. If you ever heard that expression, the people who wanted to flip houses buy a house, do some, modest changes to it, and then try to sell it for a big gain, right? So you're looking for a quick return. And my history lesson usually tells me that that's not the best way to make money. Like, it's good if you can succeed at it. Watch The Wolf of Wall Street, as long as you don't engage in criminal behavior, right? So because of all this, stocks their value would inflate. So the stock value would go up, not because the company had gotten that much more profitable, but because people were buying it. So just like anything else, when there's a rush to buy it, what does it do to the value? Pushes the price up, right? So even blue chip companies found themselves in this, like General Electric. Their stock was skyrocketing. Well, people are like, yeah, that's awesome. And that created greater demand, which fueled it even further, okay? The problem is, if you're going to then turn around and withdraw your money right out of the investment, the company can't use that. Like if you're putting money into your company and then all of a sudden somebody jerks it out, that's not long-term investment. You understand? That's short-term capital. So these traders, and it reminds me of the Fisk Gould guys. You remember them? The guys that cornered the gold market? What they did was they bought up enough of it so that they could control the price. So that's what speculators start doing. They start like buying up a whole company, we call this like a hostile takeover, just to inflate the value of the stock, right? And this just kept growing and growing. All through the 20s, stocks would go up, up, up. And so I think that it was in September of 1929, A guy who was worth today, we would consider a multimillionaire, was named Joseph Kennedy. And Joseph Kennedy, who's, by the way, the father of John Kennedy, he was sitting in the New York Stock Exchange getting his shoes polished. And that was a thing back then. Like, you had these little kids who would, shine people's shoes. And his shoe shine boy was given stock tips. And he turned around and shorted the market the next day and sold everything. He said, if I'm getting stock advice from shoe shine boys, who's buying stock from shoe shine boys? There's like nobody else to buy stocks. Like, this is it. Who are they going to sell it to? And so he quit the market like a month before, and he stayed a millionaire during the Great Depression. So much so he would get the very first job to run the Securities and Exchange Commission to oversee the stock market, right? So Joe Kennedy's a neat guy. But nonetheless, this was a huge sense of inflated value. And so here's the trigger. If you ever want to look to one single moment when the whole house of cards toppled, you can blame it on a British bank, right? Or a set of British banks. So the problem in Europe for rich people was the Brits, particularly, were putting their money into American businesses. Well, that's great for America. The Brits were, guys, I don't know if you know this or not, but some of my investment are in other countries' businesses. They're overseas markets, we call them, right? And so the British looked around, they're like, the best place to make money is in America. So when a British bank raised interest rates, now why would they do that? Well, they want to bring money into their bank. See, if you have higher interest rates in your bank, you get savings returns, right? And that's exactly what happened. People were starting to get a little bit leery of Wall Street. Like, they're like, a lot of people on Wall Street seem to be more like gamblers than safe financiers, right? These are not JP Morgan doing this kind of stuff, okay? And so this British bank raises interest rates. When that happened, that meant some of the money that was invested in the stock market was withdrawn, right? And when that money came out of the stock exchange, people started looking around and saying, what do they know that we don't know? And they started pulling their money out of the stock exchange, out of stocks, right? Well, that creates a panic sell-off. That's what we call that, a panic sell-off, meaning all of a sudden, everybody wants to get rid of their stocks, right? And so, if you go back to October, keep in mind, these guys own, some of the guys doing the trading don't actually have that much of their own money in it. These are other people's money that's vanishing, right? They're accountable for it. These are the guys that some of these traders are going to end up killing themselves on Black Thursday, or actually the next day, like Friday. So what happens is when this panic selling occurs, the stock market plummets in value, right? And I wrote down here on the day of Black Tuesday, 16 million shares were sold off, right? Which 2 months later was $40 billion in losses. So it's like a giant eraser, just erased $40 billion in 1929. It was a catastrophic collapse. Like never before had anything like this happen in American history. And of course, we've never been this invested in the stock market in American history. This was a situation where overnight people's life savings just vanished. All their money just went down. And I think about that at times. I really do, because today our government steps in, right? But what happens if we get to a point where the government can't step in? So I'm like, I'm in the stock market, but I'm also in gold, I'm in other stuff too, because I don't want, if the New York Stock Exchange goes belly up, I don't want to have no savings. So, some people think Bitcoin might be the future of it. I'm like, anything that involves technology, I'm not going to trust totally. I'm a Luddite when it comes to that stuff. But nonetheless, now I will tell you this. I want to go ahead and make this point. Here in Pittsylvania County, if you ask people how their life was affected by the Great Depression, they'll say not much. In fact, they'll say our lives are already a Great Depression, right? Because Southside Virginia was poor. And Southside Virginians were not invested in the stock market. They were already very poor. And so life was hard for them in 1928 and life was hard for them in 1931. It really affects all that urban industrial America we were just talking about in the 1920s. All those cities, all those places where factories were. And this is going to be really devastating on them because that's the majority of the American people. So I've got this long list. It's a really long list and it doesn't quite follow your text, but you'll figure it out. And so I want to put down here the number one cause, I believe, is overproduction. Think in our course's history, This is a form of over speculation, right? Like throughout our country's history, some risky investors have bought too much land, right? Bought too much railroads, invested in too many factories. Well, in this case, we've made too many cars. We've made too many radios. We've made too many vacuums and too many washing machines. And we don't have enough people to buy them. Nor, here's the other big catch, and I really want to emphasize this too, because whenever I hear people criticizing the idea of raising the minimum wage, I'm like, guys, the minimum wage means people will go out and spend more money. That's all it means. And if it means inflation, well, it ain't going to hurt most Americans, right? The inflation would only really be enough to affect the really wealthy, because the thing is during the 20s, guess whose wages didn't go up? Working class people. The wealthy got very, very wealthy during the 20s. You understand? All those tax cuts on the wealthy. Well, that meant who couldn't buy all those new technology devices as much? They were already borrowing to buy those, but they couldn't really buy them in cash. And so if you want to keep our economy going, you have to pay people enough money to purchase stuff. Like if they can't consume, then our whole economy stops. And that's something we discovered in the 20s, is that people were just borrowing to kind of buy the cool gadgets and stuff. And ultimately, they're going to lose every bit of it. Too much credit, way too much credit. And I mean credit for people who probably shouldn't have had it. That's also, by the way, the cause of the Great Recession. Too many people borrowed too much money at terrible interest rates to buy houses, right? Well, in the 1920s, people were borrowing money to buy everything. Cars, obviously, right? I showed you back in the 20s, the installment plans, right? $3 down, pay for the rest later. That's very enticing. I don't have to pay much money up front. It's an allure, though. It's fake. It's a lure, just like in fishing, to draw you in. And man, Americans had bit into this. Now, every major recession, certainly in the 19th and 20th century, is somewhat the product of technological unemployment. That just happens. We can't solve technological unemployment if we create new technology. So, the problem is with these new tractors, with trucks and refrigerator vehicles, people are going to lose their jobs. And so that compounds the problem, right? But I would really go back to the very beginning. The trigger is that, these European banks, as soon as the run on the stock market occurs, they're going to run on every investment in America. When I say run, they're going to try to get their money back. And the problem is the people they've loaned the money to, banks or companies, don't have it. They don't have it on hand. I told my boys last night, we were talking at dinner, I said, if the economy collapsed tomorrow, right, and the bank came and said, we want our money back from your house, I'd be like, here's the $9,800 left I owe on. I take it out of savings, and here's my house. It's paid for. But if they came to me 20 years ago and said, I want $150,000, what can I do? I couldn't give them $150,000 or $100,000. I didn't have that laying around. So when the bank came asking people for their money, people were like, we don't have it. We borrowed it to pay it off in installments, not all at one time, right? And so that meant banks went bankrupt. They didn't have enough money to pay their creditors. See, banks owe money just as much as people owe banks, right? And so banks couldn't pay because, well, their money wasn't coming back to them. It just vanished. This was terrible. I also can't emphasize enough how stupid-headed our policymakers were. Now, Hoover thought this was a bad idea, but he didn't veto it. He should have. The idea of raising tariffs amidst all of this is absolutely wrong-headed, right? So now we're looking at some of the European issues. The problem, of course, I think I misspelled Macumber there. I think it's MCC, to double check. Let's see. I think it's like this. Kind of looks like cucumber. So these enormously high tariffs, keep in mind the Hawley Smoot tariff, by any stretch of the imagination, is insane. Can you imagine paying 60% tax on anything? Right? So the Hawley Smoot tariff cripples global trade at a time when we had surpluses. We thought our policymakers thought this would incentivize Americans to buy American products. They didn't have any money. How are they going to buy American products? Germany's reparations meant the whole European economy had like an anchor holding it down. Because Germany couldn't pay its reparations, and British and Austrian and French banks had that on their balance sheets. They had German debt as part of their credit. And that doesn't actually add up to anything. That's kind of a trick, an accounting trick our country is doing right now. We don't account for, as part of the national debt, the amount of money the government owes the Federal Reserve. So that's debt we really have, but we don't count it. We also don't count the debt for obligations we have to Social Security and Medicare. Like we have to pay those, but we don't count that in the deficit. So another oops accounting trick, right? So we're going to look at the Dust Bowl more, and it is an absolute environmental catastrophe. But one thing, I put a couple things in here that your book doesn't mention. For one of those is this huge land boom in Florida. Florida was like this untapped wilderness that people were selling sight unseen large places to buy. Now, I want to tell you something. People were buying houses, or they weren't buying houses, they were buying land in what they thought was this vacation paradise, right? Well, it turns out they were buying land in the Everglades, right? Like they were buying swampland. So they didn't know. They saw a brochure, they paid money, and of course, this proved to be a complete fraud. A lot of this was fraudulent. Here are pictures of the Dust Bowl. These are counties where the vast majority of the topsoil just blew away. So you can see here, like that's a car that's buried in dirt, right? So, and we'll look at the Dust Bowl, one of my favorite topics again. So the Florida land boom, for whatever reason, like I said, that doesn't make it in there. And then I really think the book fails by not pointing out how the Federal Reserve didn't do anything. The Federal Reserve had the ability early on to raise interest rates. The Federal Reserve early on had the ability to inject money into the economy, with an elastic monetary supply, creating more money. But very, very anti-inflation. So, by the way, I really want to emphasize this too. The Great Depression is marked not by inflation. The only place that had inflation was Germany, and that was in the 20s. By the 30s, it's deflation. Nobody has any money, right? So you're going to hear guys during the Depression say, brother, can you spare a dime, right? A dime meant a day's wage that you could eat off of. So if you could get a dime. So you had guys who had bought a car for $1,150 in August of 1929. In January of 1930, they were trying to sell it for $100. You understand? Like a 90% loss, just trying to get cash. Nobody had cash. It was all gone, all dried up. And the Fed didn't print more. They didn't, right now the Fed has been printing money almost nonstop for the last 15 years, if you didn't know that. It's like quantitative easing, and it's working. Inflation's still low. And as far as I'm aware, it seems to work. It didn't do anything during the Depression. Like the Fed did not respond. So I think this is a huge policy error. But I'm going to give you an acronym to write out on the side that you have to kind of know. It's very easy. You don't have to, but it's the one that's going to be able to clear this. So it's a way to remember the causes of the Depression, the easiest causes. And it's crash. It's an acronym. So what caused the Depression? Crash. All right. So the C is too much credit. So if you look back in your list, you'll see way too much credit, right? So people bought stuff they couldn't afford. And, this is one of those dilemmas I'm thinking about with colleges today. You shouldn't have to buy an education you can't afford. And so education should not be the domain of the wealthy alone, elite. And so we need to come up with a way to not put our young people, you guys, under massive debt right out of college, because y'all shouldn't be borrowing that much money when you're 19 and 20 years old. I mean, it's just not reasonable. And really, your parents in their 50s shouldn't be borrowing that much money. Like that doesn't make sense either, like 40s. So, that's a problem. So too much credit to people who couldn't afford it. Almost every recession of the 20th century is due to this. It's basically banks over speculating and who's going to pay their loans. And if they don't pay their loans, who will bail them out, they hope? The government, right? The government will come in. So that's the optimism of today's banking industry. Reparations, again. And so this, as I said, is like the anchor on the European economy. You go back to the Brits and the French and America and the Dawes Plan and Coolidge, and I feel like you knew that felt right to demand that they pay their loans. Like it seems ridiculous to say, I don't pay your loans. But the outcome was so much worse that sometimes I think we have to consider other answers than what seems to be the right one. It really feels weird. So like in this year, I think about it sometime. I'm letting students turn in work as late as they can turn it in. Now, I'm saying it's because it's this year. There are people, I said all along, I thought it was a bad idea. It creates a bad precedent. But you know what? We're in the midst of a pandemic. It's an unusual period of time. So I'm going to be willing to accept it, right? And I don't like it. But sometimes you don't like the medicine you have to prescribe, right? So they're going to screw up here, and we really pay the price for it. I put this in front of overproduction. So I just say American overproduction. Okay, America made too much stuff, and when you consider, nobody's sitting around usually saying, this is going to be the best year. Next year we should be cautious. Next year we shouldn't produce as much, unless it's a bad year. But if it's a good year, you're like, let's make more. Let's make more money. And then, of course, the stock market itself. So you can call stocks on margin. You can call the stock market with a danger. Now, guys, I have nothing against smart investment in the stock market. But when people manipulate the stock market, they break the rules of capitalism, then you're in trouble. Now, some people would say there should be no rules of capitalism. It's Wild West, right? But I think capitalism shouldn't be a jungle. It shouldn't be a place where people do whatever they want. And some people get hurt. I think it should have some organized rules. Just like we have ordered liberty, I think there should be ordered capitalism. It's not the Wild West every day. And then lastly, these high protective tariffs, particularly the Hawley Smoot tariff. So I know these are repeats, but it's a way to remember particularly those 5. Crash, credit, reparations, American overproduction, the stock market, and high tariffs. So once you get that, you pretty much got the major causes.
That tariff that you said?
Hawley Smoot, or Smoot-Hawley. You'll sometimes see it written that way.
Is that the highest tariff?
It's highest ever. Yeah, Hawley Smoot tariff is higher even than the so-called tariff of abominations, the black tariff of 1828. So, yeah, it's crazy.
Is that under Hoover?
Yes, and he didn't veto it, 1930. Yeah. In other words, now I will tell you this. They started drafting the bill before the stock market crash. So remember, the stock market crashes in almost the end of October. Bills take a long time to get through and get signed into law. And so the stock market hadn't crashed, but it was still too high. I mean, and what happens is, and I should explain this, there's no such thing really as the Hawley Smoot tariff. It's the tariffs, plural, collectively, are counted as an aggregate percentage. So what you do is you put a tariff on the individual products. So like you put a tariff on steel, or you put a tariff on, I don't know, plastic, or a tariff on whatever. And then, because the Hawley Smoot tariff had variable rates depending on what it was. And this is what lobbyists do. Lobbyists got these tariffs passed to protect their businesses. But their businesses didn't need protection. Their businesses needed to sell. And protection doesn't work that way. That's not bad planning. So I've got some images here, the Dust Bowl, which we'll come back and look at too again when President Roosevelt tries to solve this problem. Here's the crash. Look at how much money is lost in 3 years. That's billions and billions of dollars in 1930s money. Okay, so a devastating downturn in the economy. All right, so we talked about one of the problems with the stock market is when you buy today, by the way, I'll tell you some sort of spoilers here. Today, every quarter, companies have to report their earnings. They're called quarterly earnings statements, right? And so if your businesses aren't doing well, do you, the investor, know? Yes, so businesses have to be transparent on how their money is, right? And that way you as an investor can make informed decisions. Well, they didn't have to do that in 1929, right? And so you had a lot of fraudulent claims of businesses' value. So that's what this is right here. Price earnings. What they are really is the red, the value of the actual company. The blue is what it was inflated on Wall Street. So in other words, during the Great Depression, the value of these companies was so inflated, it didn't actually reflect the profitability of those companies. And so I see this happen periodically in America today. Most recently, GameStop, right? GameStop is not a valuable company. It is a dinosaur. It is on its way out. Now, I like GameStop. I take my sons to it. It's really cool. We like buying used video games. But in reality, the 21st century is going to be about streaming unlimited video games through your machine. Right? It's not going to be about walking into a brick and mortar store any more than a Blockbuster video is, right? So during the 20s, people were making up the value of their company and reporting that. And it was absolutely false. So you do need to know that. Okay. Now, what about everybody else? Well, poor people are already poor, right? The problem is, once these companies started losing this money, they had to lay off people, right? That's the first thing a business usually does, is cut its workforce. Well, that means less purchasing even more, right? And it creates this downward spiral. 25% of the American workforce will be unemployed. 25%. I mean, that's the worst it's ever been. We consider 13% horrifying. We're at almost no unemployment today, even with the pandemic, right? So to have 25% unemployment, that means, like, in our class, 1 out of every 4 working parent wouldn't have a job. And these were not people who got fired because they were inept or not good or done something wrong. These were working Americans who desperately wanted a job. They were looking for work and couldn't find it. So people like to blame the poor for being poor. Well, these people wanted to work, but there was no way to get a job. And unfortunately, it just kept cycling down. See, once the cycle of credit and employment stops, it locks. And it takes years sometimes. Remember the long depression of 1890s? It takes sometimes almost a decade to recover from it. And so during this period, people stop producing as much. Well, when you stop producing as much, well, that's more people laid off. So it continues further down. And during this period, the government did nothing to affect the economic cycle from 29, 30, and 31. So that just meant it kept spiraling downward and down. Really terrible period. Okay. So our society, and it's still to this day based on this, is what's called the employment cycle. So employers employ people. They use their money to buy these stuff the employers make, and that keeps the business, and it creates this pattern, right? Now, today, a lot of our production is exports, and a lot of our purchases are imports. So that's really different today than it was in the 1920s. One of the reasons why we're able to live comfortably today is we import cheap stuff from all over the world, and that's beneficial if you want a lot of stuff. The problem was we were actually becoming far more productive with less people. See, I think there's going to be a time in American future that we're going to have to decide that we don't need to work 40-hour weeks. We're going to need to recognize that we're working too hard, right? Because what we're doing is producing so much stuff, right? Well, that was a problem in the 20s, and it wasn't the people that were producing; it was machinery. You see this? This is like people were actually idle, and productivity was going up, and so we're going to get to a point where mechanization is going to make human labor much more obsolete, and it's all going to be what? Intellectual labor. We live in what's called the information age. Y'all don't need to do what machines can do. Y'all have to do what machines can't do. And so this was sort of the beginning of that, right? The beginning of that period. And that led to, like I said before, lots of overproduction. So, and I mentioned this, I'm kind of getting into depth in this. Almost half the country were middle class, okay? That was a great period in the 20s. But the problem was the amount of people who owned the bulk of the amount of money was less than 1%. So in other words, the poor stayed very, very poor during the 20s. Middle class love life. The rich really love life, right? So the rich got fabulously wealthy during the 20s. And these are the business owners and the wealthy class. Middle class had done pretty well, right? The problem is the salaries created by for the middle class. So you're an architect, you're an engineer, you're a teacher, accountant, lawyer. That needs service. And once these businesses got laid off, that meant you couldn't find work yourself, middle class people. So if Danville loses Goodyear, that's a good example. Goodyear is the cushion for Danville because those guys working 60-hour weeks, taking home time and a half, right, are the ones that go out and spend their money in every restaurant in Danville, every hair salon, right, everything that involves a service sector. Someone is paying for out of the production sector. You understand? Out of the manufacturing sector. And it was during this period that we had really started to shift to the service sector. And once people stopped buying stuff, well, you didn't need middle class workers, right? And so the middle class lost their jobs. And that's when people really started to wake up and say, wait a minute, middle class can't lose their jobs. Like this is one thing for poor people to be out of work. When the middle class starts shrinking, everybody gets upset. Case in point is today. The more the middle class shrinks today, the more angry Americans are going to become. You understand? So when you see the January 6th events, those weren't like penniless poor people marching on Washington. They're middle class people who are upset about the future of our country, right? There are a lot of middle class people who are upset. Well, that was the Roaring Twenties end. The Great Depression affected ordinary middle class people. By the way, the rich, by and large, sailed through it, right? Like they had a way to avoid the Great Depression. I told you about Joe Kennedy, but a lot of them had moved their money into gold or other forms of real estate they already had. So, and I don't like to describe this as rich v. poor. I'm just talking about which groups didn't benefit. Okay, here's the tariffs. I mentioned this yesterday. 1,000 economists. This is a New York Times headline. 1,028 economists asked Hoover to veto the tariff bill. Right? It was literally a terrible, terrible act to do. It was stupid. And it was fatal because it really made the depression worse. I'm not going to say the Holy Spirit tariff caused the depression because it actually came after the stock market crash, but it made it far worse and far longer. Okay, particularly the idea of reciprocity. Remember what that means? Reciprocity means if you put tariffs on us, we have no choice but to put tariffs on you. Right? That's how we're going to get it. It's called a trade war. And we had a little bit of one of those under President Trump. Thank goodness, not too bad. And I mentioned earlier, banks were trying to find gold. The Brits had gone on an all gold currency, the gold standard. And the Russians were producing wheat, which was half the price of American grain. Keep in mind, the Russians are starvation, and Stalin starving them to death. Like literally, this is the Great Leap Forward. The 5-year plan. Excuse me. Mao did the Great Leap Forward, but the 5-year plan meant grain was very cheap, right? And that meant, American farmers couldn't ship their grain either. So all these European banks went bankrupt too. So pretty much the modern industrialized world went bankrupt. Okay, so what did Hoover do about it? Well, first of all, he was enormously unpopular by this point. My wife's grandmother passed away a couple of years back now, and she was 106 when she passed, and she could remember Herbert Hoover. 106, yeah. Yeah, I think that was her age when she passed, 105 or 6. But yeah, she actually could remember the presidency of Herbert Hoover, like when this happened. And she remembered that people hated him. Like that was a very common attitude about Herbert Hoover. And it's ironic because Herbert Hoover was really a kind man. Like he cared a lot about humans. He's a very big humanitarian. But Hoover was really stuck between his philosophy and reality. Hoover wanted to help people. He really did. Keep in mind, by the way, folks, I should point this out. During this period, you're going to have homeless communities will become known as Hoovervilles, and homeless people will wrap themselves in Hoover blankets, which are newspapers. So Hoover's name itself, like Van Buren back in 1937, becomes synonymous with the Depression. Hoover himself. So Hoover is torn. He wants to help. So he actually gets a law passed that is, from his perspective, help. The RFC. Okay? The RFC. And the RFC is an interesting idea. It is a government-created business, in essence, corporation, that has basically a bank. The government created a bank to loan money to banks and factory owners, to banks and corporations. But if you're doing the math here, he's on the wrong side of the ledger. Why is loaning money to banks and corporations not really what we need in the employment cycle? Okay. They're not going to use this money to employ people. They're going to use this money to pay their creditors, like the people, or they're going to hold on to it, which is exactly what happened, by the way, during the Great Recession. The federal government gave banks lots of money to try to keep them afloat, but then the banks held on to the money. They didn't loan it out to anybody. So then we had to give money to companies and say, all right, spend this money. Well, the problem is it's not an issue of production. We had overproduced. It's an issue of consumption. The supply was plentiful. The demand was non-existent. So this didn't work. The RFC was, an idealized help. It looks like he really backfired too, because it looked like he was helping big business. Like they're not the reason, but they're not the ones who should be helped. The Americans complain. We should be helped. But Hoover was vehement. And keep in mind, Hoover was a rags to riches story, right? Hoover had survived the Panic of 1893, and he believed fundamentally that one of the key American virtues is individualism, self-reliance, right? And so if the government gave assistance like they were doing in Europe, like Hitler was doing, then that would undermine what it means to be an American. So in other words, Americans would no longer be strong individuals if they become reliant on the government. That was Hoover's philosophy. So he eventually sort of changes his mind a little bit. And that's probably good that he did, because, you know, I think people were wrote him out of town on a rail if he hadn't done some things. But nonetheless, Hoover is torn. And so finally, oh, by the way, this is a picture from during Hoover's presidency of a family in Texas. This is a family that used to be like a white middle-class family in Texas, who are now living in a single dwelling that's thrown together by scrap wood without running water or power, right? They couldn't pay their bills, so they had to basically build a shack. And this is all across the country. People couldn't pay their mortgage, so they got evicted. And I mean, what are you gonna do? You're gonna you can't live anywhere. So they built shanties. You know, they built shacks to live in all across the country, and that's Texas. But it was everywhere. So Hoover creates this RFC. It doesn't really work, but he does lay the foundation. And I think the book gives him credit fairly for what the New Deal becomes. So just like the Articles of Confederation didn't really work, but they were the bridge to the Constitution, Hoover, his policies don't really work that much, but they create an environment where what FDR does will work. And so most notably, so I've already mentioned this. So this is the RFC. Again, this is Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Don't let the word Reconstruction throw you off. That's not Reconstruction of the era of Reconstruction. It's trying to reconstruct the American economy. So Hoover is actually going to fund, the federal government is going to fund a massive building project. I don't know if you guys follow the news or not, but President Biden, the Congress just passed this huge stimulus bill to help America during the pandemic, help schools. And this was the third of its kind. But that wasn't President Biden's agenda. That just kind of had to be done, he felt. He now wants to spend trillions of dollars in what's called infrastructure, an environmental infrastructure of the United States. Well, Hoover is going to spend billions on very needed public works programs, most notably the Hoover Dam. So the Hoover Dam is going to dam the Colorado River, and this is going to control water flow to 5 western states, including California, Southern California. It creates Lake Mead, which is there. That's Lake Mead. And perhaps for future reference, it famously powers Las Vegas. So this dam is still very popular. It's still in existence, and the Colorado River is still the river that most of those states rely on for water. Now, it is shrinking now because of big cities like in the desert. But this was a major step towards what would later become like FDR's huge, and I mean big time, public works programs. So definitely be aware of the Hoover Dam. If you've seen, is it Transformers where they have one of them stored in this thing? Anyway, you'll see the Hoover Dam in movies sometimes. Very big. It's like, I guess it's Megatron or one of them is stored inside the Hoover Dam. It's the biggest building they could find to keep them. I don't remember. But this thing costs, the Hoover Dam and the RFC spent over $2 billion. So, $2 billion is a lot of money for the federal government to spend. Now, it is absolutely nothing compared to the New Deal, but, at the time, this was record. By the way, FDR is going to run against Hoover's deficits, his deficit spending, like as if FDR. So anyway, this is funny because it does cost a lot of money. You have a senator from New York named Fiorello LaGuardia. He used to be the mayor of New York City. There's an airport in New York named after him. So he's a big-time union man, big-time fan of organized labor. And the Democrats are going to take back Congress, as you might imagine, in the midterm elections. And they're going to start passing some legislation. But a lot of times they're not going to help Hoover at all. They're going to work it. So in other words, conservative Republicans and Democrats aren't going to help Hoover. They're not going to work. They're going to make politics out of the Depression. Terrible. But do know the Norris-LaGuardia Act, because you remember those injunctions? It exempts unions from anti-strike injunctions. So that's a big deal. And it outlawed the yellow dog contract. And the yellow dog contract is the contract that requires that you not join a union. It's kind of the opposite of the close shop where you had to join a union. A yellow dog contract said you will never join a union. And so this forbade that too. So this is a pro-labor bill passed under Hoover, right? And that's pretty interesting, I think. And I would be aware of that. But keep in mind, politics during the Great Depression were not particularly beneficial. Democrats used this as a way to get in office and to weaken Hoover. They're not going to support his agenda at all. So moving down, you're going to see a lot of frustrated people. Okay, so you're going to have farmers who dump their milk out rather than sell it at losses. You're going to have people who are trying to sell apples. I'll show you guys some of the pictures of like grocery stores, like how cheap goods were, things like that. But perhaps the most, I think, tragic event of 1931, and excuse me, 1932, is the bonus army. So the bonus army is, you remember we were talking about the bonuses that were passed over Coolidge's vetoes that were in 1921 that would be paid off in 1945, right? Like you would get, veterans would get a sort of pension, a retirement fund. Well, about 20,000, that's a big number, 20,000 veterans march on Washington demanding their bonus early. They're saying, we're not going to make it to 1945. We're starving. And they erect a massive tent city. It's really a Hooverville in Anacostia, right outside the city. And it's got, people are burning fires there, and there's open sewage. And it's really terrible. It's like a sad place. 20,000 people have gathered. And so Hoover sends in the U.S. Army stationed at Fort Myer to disperse the veterans, led by a one-star general named Douglas MacArthur. Now, the interesting thing to me about this is one of MacArthur and Patton is with him, George Patton, and they're going to end up using tear gas and rifles, and American veterans are going to die in this. They're going to end up dispersing this violently. The tear gas is flammable, and so when they launch the tear gas, they have these like tin cans that are with open fire, and it catches the whole place on fire. And thousands of people are hurt, injured, and hundreds are really sick from this. And one of the sad stories about it is Patton. Patton lived in D.C. He actually lived in Virginia, in Fort Myer, and my grandmother used to house sit his house. Like when he was out of town, she would keep his pets and stuff and make sure that they were walked. And Patton goes into this army. And when he was in France at Meuse-Argonne, he got shot through the rear end. A bullet went through his rear and came out of his groin. And it almost severed completely his femoral artery. And so one of his private soldiers saved him, dragged him into a bomb hole, a crater, and staunched the blood flow, kept him from bleeding to death. Well, that guy had come to D.C. a few times and asked for money, and Patton's wife had given it to him. So the guy came up to him at the bonus army and said, General Patton, you remember me? I'm your orderly that helped you. And Patton said, I don't know this man. Because they viewed these guys as like communists, as like radicals, because they were marching on Washington, right? And they dispersed it violently. And it was really just a sad moment, because here you have the army dropping a hammer on army veterans, and so this is the bonus army. And it was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. The election had already occurred. You can see it's December of 32. Hoover had already lost. But, at this point, it was clear that, he was not going to be around any longer, President Hoover. So naturally, when the whole world is reeling from, the Depression, what better time than to violate all those agreements you signed, right? So if you know anything about Japan's history, Japan has a new dynasty in charge after Matthew Perry. You guys remember Matthew Perry, the guy who opened trade with Japan? So they had created a modern Japanese imperial government modeled after Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, okay? And they had a young emperor who was very young. His name was Hirohito. And so the army was really in charge of Japan. The army of Japan and its generals ran Japan. And so one of the things Japan desperately needed was natural resources. If you know anything about Japan, it's a volcanic island. You know, they grow cherries and rice, and that's about it. So they need like iron and coal and metal and stuff like that. And so China has a ton of that stuff. They also want the railroad that's in Mukden. And so they dress up some Japanese soldiers as Chinese and attack themselves, right? This is called the Mukden incident. They claim the Chinese have attacked them. They didn't. The Japanese faked it. And then they invade Manchuria, which is this region of China that they want for its resources. Russia also wanted. Now, keep in mind, this is a gross violation of the open door policy. This is an absolute rejection of the League of Nations covenant. This is a rejection of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Everything Japan has signed, this is breaking it. And so the League of Nations says, well, we should do something. And the likely response would be a naval blockade of Japan, like basically block Japan in and not let them do this. But the League doesn't have any authority. It can't make a blockade. The League can't do anything. And America is not in it. And so the League issues a verbal reprimand. Japan promptly quits the League of Nations. And America, we've got our own problems. So we issue a statement. And that statement is known as the Stimson Doctrine. All right. So this is Secretary of State Stimson. This is Herbert Hoover, Secretary of State. And it said we would not recognize any territory gained by force. Now, some would say that's somewhat ironic, you know, considering 90 years before, we had taken over half of Mexico by force, right? But nonetheless, this is a different America, right? We don't approve of nations taking over other countries' land. And the U.S. said we would not recognize that. And so Japan was like, wait a minute now. You guys are always conquering territory. Thank you, the Philippines. And nobody tells you not to. And the minute we go and do it, y'all are going to condemn us. And I'm like, oh, you know, maybe that's an argument worth having. But nonetheless, Japan is then going to step up their abject brutality. They're going to bomb Shanghai. Then you're going to have the very infamous rape of Nanking, right? And so Japan has started World War II. Only the rest of the world doesn't know it yet. Keep in mind, we still have lots of Americans in China during this period. Lots of Europeans are in China because of the spheres of influence. But now the rest of the world is reeling from the Depression. And so I ain't going to lie to you guys. I really believe last year, in the midst of all this, that if Russia was going to start something, that was the year. You understand? If Putin was going to start a military thing that America wasn't going to deal with, and he you know, keep in mind, Putin is basically on the record trying to get Trump reelected. He assumed, I think, that Trump wouldn't act. So I was very concerned last year that either the Chinese or the Russians would do something. But I guess the good news is, if there is any good news, they had the pandemic too, right? So whenever a country is reeling, keep in mind, you know, you may remember the French tried to install a dictator in Mexico during our Civil War, right? So the Stimson Doctrine is a statement, but it doesn't mean much, because what are we going to do about it? Nothing, right? So in the end, you know, after this happens, Hoover has decided, well, we need to really withdraw ourselves to some degree from our commitments abroad. Keep in mind, once the stock market crashes and these businesses collapse, that means all our overseas money starts to dry up too. Our money that's invested. You guys remember Taft had tried to create something called dollar diplomacy? The idea of investing in other countries and then their businesses, well, that's all gone. Americans are running out of money in our country, much less other countries. So he begins to withdraw American military personnel from Latin America. Now, these are guys that Coolidge had sent in, all right? And he withdraws them from Haiti. He withdraws them from Nicaragua. Now, he doesn't create what's called the good neighbor policy, but he lays the foundation for it. FDR creates the good neighbor policy, which is where he rejects the Roosevelt corollary. Ironically, FDR rejects TR. And so tomorrow, we will take up this historic figure named Franklin Roosevelt. Right? Hoover wins some New England states and Pennsylvania, and that's it. Right? This is a crushing landslide. Our GDP was half of what it was when Hoover took office. So you can see why FDR, I think the Dems could have run literally anyone in this election and gotten elected. We had placed in 42 events, 6